Welcome to World Review, our weekly look at the news from around the world. I'm Carl-Ann Robbins of the Council on Foreign Relations and Brewer College's Mark School, and a recovering journalist, sitting in this week for Ivo Dalder. Today, we're going to be looking at COP27, the UN climate change conference that's supposed to be tying up its work in Egypt. Are they going to get a deal that makes a difference, or are they even going to get a deal? The war in Ukraine after Russia retreats from Kherson, and a missile falls on Poland, raising fears of a direct NATO-Russia conflict, and global reaction to the U.S. midterm elections, and the start, deep intake of breath, of the 2024 presidential campaign. It's like those stores that put up Christmas decorations before Thanksgiving. Can we even get a small break? Here with us to discuss all of these issues, from Brooklyn, Deborah Amos, Ferris Professor at Princeton and international correspondent for National Public Radio. And I should add that for my first job in the business, I was briefly and very happily Deb's researcher. Deb, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Carlin.
Full disclosure here. From Brussels, my friend and former colleague, Steve Erlanger, chief diplomatic correspondent in Europe for the New York Times. And I wasn't his researcher, but I should have been. And from London, the redoubtable Philip Stevens, who is a fellow of the European University Institute. And you can find his writing at Inside Out on Substack, as well as at the Financial Times. So Philip, can we start with you? The news going into this COP27 climate summit was pretty grim. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change warned we would likely pass the 1.5 degrees Celsius warming target within a decade. And the UN Environment Program projected that if current policies continue, the planet will see a 2.8 degrees Celsius temperature rise. Or as UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, and who knew he was an AC/DC fan, put it, we are on a highway to climate hell with our foot still on the accelerator. So what's going on in Egypt? They were supposed to be wrapping things up as we speak. Is there a chance of any progress? And this was supposed to be the conference where the Global South, which has been taking the brunt of the harms, finally got a real say and some real cash for loss and damage.
Right. Well, I think, sad to say, we can be pretty sure that this COP is not going to be a great success. I think the question, we're in the last 24 hours, these things are always overrun. So I'd expect them to go into the weekend and maybe well into the weekend. But it's pretty clear it's not going to be a success. The question now is whether they can avoid a failure. And as you said, when at the beginning of the conference a couple of weeks ago, Mr. Guterres, as you said, Secretary General of the UN, talked about this was a moment for a solidarity pact between the rich, if you like, worst offenders among the emitters and the poorer South. By yesterday, deeply frustrated, Mr. Guterres was talking about a breakdown of trust between the North and the South. And there have been a lot of different points of contention, ranging from the sort of dash for gas in Europe and elsewhere, in the US following the Ukraine war, which is seen as rolling the clock back, as it were, and the question of as ever, who's responsible, whether this is as some in the South talk about it, this is fossil fuel colonialism still being imposed via COP on the South. But I think, as you say, the main, if you like, argument, the central argument has been on what's called the demand of the G77 countries from the South for what's called a loss and damage fund. And that's a fund financed largely by the rich industrial countries, a fund that they want to cope with the damage to the physical and social infrastructure being done by climate change. And the position of Europe, the US, and others has so far been, no, look, there are lots of other financing instruments we've already put in place. And hey, it's not just for us rich nations to pay up. What about China and others, middle income countries? They should be contributing. Until, a dozen hours ago, it looked like deadlock. Now, the EU has come forward with a proposal, a sort of make or break proposal, saying, look, we're prepared to consider this fund and contribute to it. Their proposal is sketchy. It doesn't meet all the G77 demands, but it's on the table, so it gives them something to negotiate about. in the next 24 hours or so. There's also been actually, almost on as it is to say, there has been some good news on climate, and it came from Bali, from the G20 meeting, where we saw, the G20 reaffirm the 1.5 degree target or ceiling. Now, you may say, well, it's been lost, but it was very important that it was reaffirmed, and I think the COP27 will do the same. And we also saw China, which had basically withdrawn from all cooperation, and particularly with the US, on climate after Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan in the summer. China come back and say, okay, we'll come back into bargaining. And then we saw President-elect Lulu turn up in Sharm el-Sheikh and say, hey, Brazil is getting back into the business, getting back into the fight against global warming. We're going to end what's left of the Amazon. We're going to end deforestation. So there are some glimmers there. So what I expect, and I don't like to predict, is that they will come together with some sort of statement, a collective resolve, as it were, which won't solve all these problems, but will bring them close enough together to say, and this is now an annual process, that we kept on track, as it were, for the next COP next year. Not great, but not disaster.
So, being journalists, of course, we never want to be too upbeat. So I'm going to turn over to Steve here. I mean, the EU riding to the rescue, or at least coming up with, a proposal that has the potential for moving things forward. At the same time, and the Europeans have been a lot more committed to tackling climate change than we in the US have. And Europe remarkably is warming around twice as fast as the rest of the world. That was an extraordinary report that's come out. But, the war in Ukraine has certainly made it harder for Europe to respond, at least in the near term. Where is Europe standing on all of this itself? Is it really the shining beacon, or are they falling backwards?
Well, they always want to be the shining beacon. That's the European aspiration. Inevitably, they fall a bit backwards because it's complicated, and there are 27 countries, and they have very different interests and different industrial bases. But they have put things into law. I mean, they have required reductions of carbon into law. They've made decisions about when to get rid of gasoline-powered cars and diesel-powered cars, and even talking about getting rid of hybrids altogether. So they do want to set a model to the world. They also want to develop technologies that the rest of the world can buy to be greener. That's another European aim. So they're investing in that also. I mean, it's not completely altruistic. And they do see their role, particularly between China and the United States, are always looking for a way to distinguish themselves. And climate is certainly one of them. So I'm not really surprised that they would make a decent offer at COP to create this fund that Philip described very well, and to push China to try to contribute. I think this is a very important gesture to, it's not just the global South, it's partly the global North. It's poorer countries who are going to get clobbered by climate change, which can be desertification as well as flooding, as well as lots of things. But as you implied, Carla, there's an incredible strain on the budgets. I mean, first of all, we all know there's incredible inflation. The central banks aren't sure what to do. Energy prices in Europe are extremely high, higher than in America. There's enough gas for the winter, but the price of it's very high, and how they fill up the tanks in the spring is really an open question. And they're being pushed because of Ukraine to spend more on defense, to give more to Ukraine, then to replace what they have to meet NATO requirements. And plus, they're still spending money to get over COVID. So there's an awful lot of burden on finances. And so I think their heart's there. I mean, they have this policy they call Fit for 55, which we've all joked should belong to a yoga studio and not to a government policy. Maybe it'll become Fit for 62, but they are sincere about it. And so I do, I give them a lot of credit. And Frans Timmermans in particular, the Dutch negotiator, who's in charge of climate, I give him a lot of credit too, like John Kerry. I mean, they actually really care.
He certainly was sort of blitzing the Chinese when he was there. And he said that when he was talking about this fund that Philip was talking about, that, that there needed to be a broad funder base and that there needed to take into account the economic situation of countries in 2022 and not in 1992. I mean, that the Chinese couldn't get a pass. Or the Chinese couldn't get a pass forever as being a developing country, which is, I'm not sure they're unlikely to go along, but he's certainly up in their face in a way that a lot of people aren't right now. So Deb, can we talk about the host and the location for this COP? I mean, Egypt and Sharm el-Sheikh. I mean, the Sisi government is a hugely repressive government and tens of thousands of political prisoners, including this climate activist Alaa Abdel Fattah. In a country where demonstrations are usually banned, there were some protests, more than expected, although minuscule when compared to previous summits. Did this meeting greenwash the Sisi government?
Hardly, although we have two examples of bad places for good events. FIFA is in Qatar and they're having their own problems.
I'm so glad we got to that.
Yes, exactly. I mean, my guess is at least you could buy beer in Egypt. But I think that there was some dampening of protests. It's not a place that you can. So greenwashing, no. And really more people were, I think, interested in the final declaration and how far anybody got than that it was in Egypt.
So how does it, why would Sisi want a conference like this then?
For the same reason that Qatar did. It is great publicity. And also, you have a great return. People stay in your hotels. There's a lot of attention to your country. I mean, think about Egypt. We have not seen them in the news for a long time. After the Arab Spring, they kind of fell out of the news. And so this brings them back in some ways. So I think that it was in their interest to have it. What Egypt gets out of that is not altogether clear. I think the topic of the conference was what was important.
I think if I could just add, I think there's something else going on here, which is, there are tenuous links between the World Cup and COP, but I think there is a sense, among a lot of these countries in, let's call it the global South, just because it's easy, that just as they no longer accept that the world and the rules belong to the West, they don't want to see all these big conferences held in the, simply in the West. They want to, there's a demonstration effect going on here. Countries that, otherwise would be, visitors or guests at the table want to be hosts. And I think you see that, you've seen that in COP, and I think you, in a small way, you see it in the football at FIFA, and I think it's going to continue. And you have it automatically at the G20 because it rotates, and so we had Indonesia, and in fact, brilliant chairmanship, I think, in Bali by the Indonesians. But so I think this is part of the future as well, that international conferences are not always going to be held in Washington or Paris or Berlin or London or whatever.
Agree.
That's a very good point, because I remember global Britain very proud of having the last COP in Glasgow.
That's me.
Just to show. It's true. I mean, just to show that it was part of the solution and it could do this and so on. So I agree with Philip. It's a place for everybody.
And you see, Bali is the exception to the rule. There weren't really human rights issues that needed to be talked about. Bali, it was all about the G20. And in some ways, it was interesting in that for all the doom scrollers, for as long as we can all do that on Twitter, it was relatively good news. This meeting between Biden and Xi showed that both sides were interested in changing the temperature a bit. I mean, maybe this goes away by early next year, but this bare knuckle competition between democracy and autocracy kind of got softened in this meeting. There weren't really tangibles, but the idea that there may be room for some cooperation, and COP doesn't go very far if China and the United States are not cooperating on this issue. So I think that was good news for a bit. And let's see how it progresses. But considering that both men came to this meeting in pretty good shape, Biden because of the midterms, Xi because he's been reelected yet again, they also had a little bit of room to be able to say, all right, we can make this a managed competition as opposed to an unmanaged competition, which raises all kinds of risks, as we see in Ukraine. When you have, a missile fall on the Poland side of the border and the entire community holds its breath for about 8 hours until, Biden comes out and says, well, we don't think it came from Russia. But, it's surprising that hadn't happened before. But I think everybody understands that there is this risk of unintended consequences in two specific places.
Well, I think Bali was also important in that it allowed the United States and Europe to detach a number of countries from Russia. I mean, we've seen since the invasion of Ukraine, most of the global south sitting on its hands. There wasn't a great condemnation in Bali and people were careful, but, we look at the conclusions and the comments made on, the effect on, energy and food supplies in the world, then you see, you saw it was a pretty uncomfortable meeting for Sergei Lavrov, who went instead of Putin. So, in fact, there's a, we in the West are going to have to get used to sort of winning round some of these middle powers, as it were. And it worked quite well, I think, in Bali.
And the optics of Lavrov, sitting on that patio in Bali with an Apple Watch and lots of Western technology, which he shouldn't be having anymore, was kind of interesting to see. The Saudis voted in the UN to say there was the resolution that said it was illegal. The annexations of Russia in parts of eastern Ukraine are illegal. The Saudis voted yes. That's also unusual. I think that comes before the midterms, but everybody is watching the midterms and they had their reactions to it.
So
the other thing about
please, Steve, go on. Yeah.
No. I was going to say the other thing that struck me as important in Bali, other than seeing them all wearing batik, which is always amusing, and we should have that once a year, is it was the first time Xi Jinping got to talk to these people and they got to talk to him. And I think on Taiwan, that was very important. I mean, that was a very important, more private conversation that Biden had with Xi Jinping. And also it was interesting, it was a chance for Justin Trudeau to complain about Chinese spying. And Xi Jinping didn't like that very, very much, but he's been so isolated, partly because of COVID, he hasn't really been seeing people. So I think it's really good for those circumstances. I mean, much the way, wasn't in Bali, but when our CIA director, Bill Burns, went to Ankara to meet with his Russian counterpart last week to talk about, hey, we know what you're talking about, and you're thinking about nukes, and don't you do it because it's going to be worse than you think. I mean, that's a very useful conversation to have face to face, and presumably that goes on up to Putin. So in a way, I'm sorry Putin didn't come, because Putin could have seen this more himself. Lavrov apparently was so concerned about coming that the first thing he had to do was go into the hospital for a checkup when he arrived in Bali. So
I think it
Anyway.
was better that Putin didn't come. Certainly, he left the Indonesians off the hook because they didn't have to worry about the seating, the seating plan at the table.
Correct.
And I think it certainly sent a very good message, that he himself realized his level of isolation, that he didn't come. So, Steve and Deb, you and Philip, you all set this up for move on to the state of the war in Ukraine. Certainly, the enthusiasm after the Ukrainians swept into the city of Kherson was quickly followed by this huge anxiety after this missile hit a village in Poland, killing 2 people. So, Steve, what was it like in Brussels, in those hours after this Polish territory was hit? And if it wasn't a Russian missile, why was Bill Burns in Ankara talking to the Russians?
Well, Bill Burns was there before the missile, right?
Ah.
So I think this really was what the White House finally admitted. It was a talk about nukes and the dangers of nukes. It was panic city. I mean, the panic made me nervous. It just made me feel like things were too on edge, right? I mean, if you were Russia and you wanted to attack Poland, you wouldn't do it by hitting a granary in the poorest part of Poland, right? That's not how you would start a war. And yet you had people tweeting about Article 5, and you had Zelensky trying to get Poland to kind of step out on its own outside NATO. And as far as I can tell, obviously it was crazy in Bali that night because they all just stay up and they were looking at intel and trying to see the trajectories, because they have a pretty good idea of what's flying around. And my impression was, certainly I wasn't in Bali, but that Biden and his people were very good at calming things down a bit and then read the riot act to the polls overnight. The polls have been very iffy. I mean, not surprisingly, they're very anti-Russia and very pro-Ukraine, and they host lots of Ukrainian refugees and so on. And people are scared. But the fact that by the morning in Brussels, everyone was reporting, there's going to be an emergency meeting of NATO. And in fact, it was a regularly scheduled meeting of NATO, a NAC meeting. Poland did not cite Article 5. It's North Atlantic Council, which is the regular meeting of all the ambassadors, which they have every Wednesday morning, basically. And nor did Poland cite Article 4, which is this sort of special request for discussions when a country feels it's at risk. So by that point, it was pretty clear it probably wasn't a Russian thing, right? So I just found it scary because people were so on edge, and it just made me think how easily this can escalate. Because frankly, I think, others may disagree with me, but I think Russia has been so careful not to let the war spill out of Ukraine. It doesn't want to fight NATO. NATO doesn't want to fight Russia. The U.S., Biden certainly doesn't want to fight Russia. He's got other things to do. The Russians haven't even attacked the equipment coming into Ukraine from Poland, right? Though this missile did hit fairly near, by accident, of course, one of the places NATO uses in Poland. So, and then I thought, Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, actually had one of his better press conferences where he, made the point that it probably was a Ukrainian missile, wasn't quite finished yet, we should all come down. And of course, it's all Russia's fault, because if it weren't for the war, none of this would have happened, right? So that was his talking point, which everyone else picked up. And of course, that day, Russia had sent about 100 missiles into Ukraine, trying to destroy Ukraine's civilian infrastructure, its power grids, its electricity, which is a war crime to try to destroy civilian infrastructure. I mean, it's a clear war crime. So I think in the end, everyone took a breath and sat back down in their seats, and it was okay. But, the panic frightened me, I have to say.
But imagine if that event had taken place, if the U.S. midterms had gone the other way. I mean, the sigh of relief was so loud in Europe that you could have heard it in Washington. It means that with how the Senate and the House is set up now, there's probably another 2 years of support for Ukraine. Had it gone the other way, I think that would have been an added risk, concern, fear of what the United States would do. I mean, it's been already interesting to watch Kevin McCarthy, who is going to be the Speaker of the House, talk about how we have to look at the money we're sending to Ukraine, and then had to back off that a bit to say, well, I didn't mean we're going to stop it, but we're just going to
look blank check.
Yeah, that's what he said. And in Europe, anyway, for the first time, Ron DeSantis is getting some press, and he's called Trump with a brain. So that will take a while. But I think in terms of Ukraine, the midterm made a difference in the hours where we weren't sure what had happened on the Polish border.
I think too that what this has done has brought back a subject, and also the Ukrainian success in Kherson as well has done this, which is a subject which went away for a few months, which was, what's the end game here? Where, at what point do we negotiate or engage with the Russians on a slightly different level? So I think the fact that it might have been, there may have been an accidental escalation has made people think again about, well, where are we going to be if the Ukrainians continue, as we hope, to be successful? Where are we going to be in February or March? And do the Russians then become, as Steve said, the Russians have been not rhetorically, but in fact quite restrained. But like you say in your excellent piece in the New York Times, Steve, that there's there's a fear that restraint might go, the more that Putin looks down the barrel at defeat. So I think those issues, which had sort of got, people had just sort of stopped talking about the end game and just talked about the war and winning the war. And I think now people are starting to begin talking about the end game, or begin to worry about the end game again.
Can I ask a question about that? Earlier this year, I was in Poland in June and ran into an American military guy who's working for Ukraine's defense ministry. And I don't follow Ukraine enough to know the answer to this question. He said, Ukraine cannot stop fighting until Kherson is in their hands. And the reason for that is it has to do with Odessa. They need a working port. Otherwise, they don't have an economy. They become a rump state of Russia. And even Zelensky said after they retook Kherson, this is the beginning of the end of the war.
Yeah,
he didn't say it much after that because there was a wave of bombings and there was the event in Poland. But I wondered if you thought that the taking of Kherson really does raise the question of how the war ends in ways that we haven't even raised the question till now.
Well, I think Kherson does two things. One, as you say rightly, it makes Odessa safe, and that was a key strategic objective. The other thing, though, it does is it gives Ukraine a starting point to push into Crimea. And so it opens a question. It can begin to sort of cutting off the water to Crimea. So it does two things. It's defensive in that it protects Odessa, but it's potentially offensive in that it provides the Ukrainian armed forces with a platform for Crimea. So there's the question.
Yeah, and Steve,
sorry, Carla, go ahead.
I was going to ask you, Steve, because the Poles backed off very quickly, but the Ukrainians haven't. And, it's almost as if Zelensky was at the kids' table in this conversation this week. And
I mean, he's annoying President Biden, which I don't think is a good idea for him to do. I mean, not just on this issue, but on other issues. He's can never seem very grateful for this huge amount of money and weaponry the U.S. is providing under Biden's leadership. In fact, they've gone out of their way to send the American ambassador in Kiev to Zelensky before these announcements to tell him to thank the president before he starts demanding more, because Biden, Biden's mood matters, right? I mean, and if there's a sense that the Ukrainians really aren't grateful for the help, frankly, we've got other things to do. But I agree with you. The longer the war goes on, of course, the more the risk of these accidents happen. I mean, have very powerful forces right next to each other. You have missiles flying through the air. You have airplanes. You've got drones. I mean, it could have been a Russian missile landing inside Poland. I mean, it's not inconceivable, or inside Hungary, or and at the same time, as Philip says, I mean, I'm very curious. General Milley, chief staff, keeps bringing up, despite the politicians telling him basically to shut up. I mean, he keeps bringing up the question of whether this is a moment for Ukraine to consolidate its gains and start talking to Russia. Now, the advantage for the Ukrainians is Russia doesn't seem to be interested in talking, especially. But how you manage the end of the war and how you manage the end of a war that Russia's essentially lost. I mean, it's losing the war. I wouldn't say Ukrainians winning it right now, but Russia's losing it. So how do you convince Putin that the risks of going farther to him and his regime are greater than, the risks of stopping, or at least having a ceasefire or something, right? I mean, these are the games going on. And then, I mean, they're perfectly rational discussions. And though Europe has been quite united, and everybody says, oh, it's up to the Ukrainians, it's up to Zelensky, it isn't altogether up to Zelensky. I mean, the United States has its own national interests, and Europeans have their own national interests. Part of their national interest is making sure Putin doesn't win the war and doesn't gain from this kind of behavior and behave from this kind of war crimes. But I don't think they're particularly interested in having Ukraine attacking Crimea. I mean, that's the Black Sea Fleet. And from Milley, you get the sense nobody really in Washington thinks they could take Crimea back anyway, unless the Russian army completely breaks and everybody runs away, which could bring Russia itself into chaos, quite honestly. You could be back into a time of troubles like the 1990s with loose nukes in Russia, and I don't think anybody wants that either. So it's a very important game going on, it seems to me, but it's too soon to know.
But don't you think that for Putin, there's Russian history has not been kind to leaders who lose wars, and he knows that better than anybody. You look at the economic contractions. Russia's 6%, Ukraine 36%, or something like that. So when he is making calculations, and he's got a break in the winter, a bit of one, it doesn't look to me, is he in any hurry? Do you see anything that tells you that Putin is in a hurry, or even, a slow walk to negotiations?
No, I mean, my sense is, and it's, who knows, right, is he thinks he can wait out the West. He thinks he can wait out Ukraine, and he's going to resume in the spring, and they'll have rebuilt as best they can. And everyone I've heard who's met him, not that that's many people, but even when you hear him publicly, he just seems very confident. So I don't know what he's hearing, but I think you're right, Deborah. I think we're going to be in this war a year from now. We can have the same conversation.
But of course, there was, Steve, another blow to Putin, the midterms. I mean, yes. If there was anyone banking on Trump doing well in the midterms or Trump's acolytes, it was Putin, because a position where you're waiting out the West with a reasonable hope that Trump might be in the White House in 2 years' time is very different from, waiting out the West with the expectation that whether it's a Democrat or a Republican, the policy in Washington isn't going to be, we love Russia from 2024, 2025. So, that's why, Europeans have been sort of celebrating the midterms, not because they all think Biden's the best thing, they've ever seen, but, this idea that Trump has been or may have been defeated, bad for Putin, good for everyone else.
You wrote this week, Philip, that Europeans felt safer now.
Yeah, they do. They do. The Europeans have had, if you talk to people in the last year or two, or the last year, two big fears. One, Putin's aggression and where that might lead and where that may escalate to. And that fear hasn't gone away, even though Ukraine is doing well. And the other, that the United States would elect again someone who says that NATO is bust and we should just leave it behind, and the United States should leave it behind, and that there's this good chap Putin in Moscow who he can get on with. So that has been, in some ways, has been seen as as big a security threat to Europe as Putin himself.
So Deb, can we talk about the broader global reaction, to the U.S. midterm elections? And as the New York Post described it, the announcement of a presidential run from Florida man, sigh of relief,
quite remarkable
anxiety at the next spectacle around the corner.
Quite remarkable how it played in the newspapers, but let's remember who owns those newspapers. That is the same man who was promoting the last time. So it's interesting to watch that. But let me tell you that
Rupert Murdoch is not from the global South. He's Australian.
That is correct. But I have to say that in Saudi Arabia, they were not applauding. They don't really understand how American politics work, but they like the Republicans. And they always have liked the Republicans, and Trump more than others. And so, MBS, the Crown Prince, I'm sure Mohammed bin Salman is doing some recalculation these days because his guys did not win. He defied Biden when he came to Riyadh before the midterms. He cut oil production, even though asked by Biden not to do that, did it anyway. And so now there is some backpedaling. For one thing, the Saudis cannot not notice that Iranian drones are doing very well in Ukraine. And the Iranians didn't sell all of them to Moscow. And when it comes to their security, if they are moving closer to Putin, Putin is not known for protecting countries when they're in trouble. So, who are you going to call if you're in some conflict with the Iranians? So that's one thing. But you can see that both sides are trying to recalibrate the relationship, both pre-midterms and after. As I said earlier, the Saudis voted with the U.S. on a UN resolution that said Russia's annexation of eastern Ukraine was illegal. They have continued to give quite a bit of aid to Ukraine. On the American side, the U.S. has just declared that Crown Prince MBS has sovereign immunity. He was designated as the prime minister of Saudi Arabia. This is absolutely vanilla in international law. Of course, he has sovereign immunity, but it matters right now because there's a suit, a domestic suit against him for killing the Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi in 2018. And it means that he cannot be held responsible in a U.S. court. This is not a big surprise. And it wasn't something that the State Department woke up 2 days ago and said, let's declare this. This is a position that they've been thinking about for a while, and they did declare it in the middle of the trial. But all of those things mean that there is a recalibration, I think, from that awful time when the fist bump happened. People were up in arms. In the United States, the human rights community was yelling and screaming about that visit. And now we'll see where the pieces land.
So, Steve, Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz also had his Xi-Fest earlier this month when he visited China. And we earlier were talking about the Biden-Xi meeting. Are the Europeans in the wake of the midterms any more likely to follow the US on China policy and particularly technology restrictions now that it looks like Biden is still in power?
You put your finger on a very sensitive topic, which is real. I mean, Europe doesn't see China as a peer rival the way the United States does. It just doesn't. And it knows that Joe Biden cares a lot about China. I mean, even at NATO, people close to the US know China, China, China. 80% of American interest is China. Ukraine matters and Russia matters, but as you know, the cliche now goes, Ukraine is a storm, but China's climate change. I mean, that is the big gorilla in the room. And this is not going to change, I don't think. I mean, the Europeans understand what China is. The Germans understand. The BDI, which is their Chamber of Commerce, was actually early in saying China is a strategic rival and an economic competitor. And that's Europe's view. But Germany needs to wean itself, and it's a slow process, particularly with the war going on. But 40% of Volkswagen's cars are sold in China, and it gets all of its batteries from China. And no, I don't think anyone wants Germany to go into a deep recession, because that would pull all of Central Europe into recession. So you have to, I think, maybe I'm too generous to the Germans, but I think you have to give them a bit of time. I think they're heading in the right direction, but they are not going to go to war against China. And Scholz going with, all these businessmen got a lot of criticism from within his own government, of course, but he did at least sort of get Xi to say he didn't like the use of nuclear weapons in a sort of Ukraine context. Macron's about to go himself. And then they're talking about a joint meeting of Xi with Macron and Scholz. And the EU still is talking to China. Now, the other thing, because Biden is pushed ahead on China, the IRA, which is not the Irish Republican Army, but the Inflation Reduction Act, is a big, hey, it's a big climate bill. It's really important, but the Europeans see it as protectionism, and they see it as unfair. And they bring it to the WTO. I mean, they're very angry about it. Bruno Le Maire, the French economics minister, called it economic warfare. So they're going, there's a place, the TTC, I'm not even sure what it stands for, but it's where the Europeans and the Americans talk about these things. So there's a meeting in a couple of weeks that will help tell the tale. But the IRA passed by one vote, so they're not going to go back to Congress on it. Maybe they can fix it, maybe they can't. But this is a very prime example of the way the American concentration on China is annoying its allies who have a very different view. Not that they love China, but it's a different set of interests about trade and everything else. Too long an answer, I'm sorry.
So it was a great answer. We have 1 minute left, so we're going to go to Final Jeopardy here. I'm going to ask each of you for a very short but pithy response here. Now that the Democrats they didn't win the midterms, but boy, they didn't lose either. What advice would you give Biden about how he presents himself to the world in the next few months? Does the Woodstock happy dance? How does he respond to the Macron-Scholz meeting? Philip, let's start with you.
Okay, I think he continues he goes on as he's been doing. He's been doing really well. He's played well on Ukraine. He's consulted. He's accepted the sort of he's solved the sort of feelings of the Europeans. I'm a bit more optimistic on China than Steve. I think they're heading in the right direction. Scholz worries about trade. Macron worries about prestige. France always has to be seen dancing on the international stage. But I think slowly but surely, Europe is understanding what China is about.
Steve?
I think Biden's doing quite well. I mean, I always think of him as the last living transatlanticist. So my best advice to him is stay alive, because that's what Europe wants.
And Deb, what's your advice? Or do you?
It's hard to top that. So here's the thing. I'm still a working journalist, so any sort of opinion is anathema to me. I find myself unable to do it. But I think the watchword is stay alive. I think that is very, very good advice, because at the moment, things are going his way. Not that he had a whole lot to do with that, but certainly the midterms were a gift for him. And I think that the point is, can he use that renewed power to sort some of the huge issues that are down the road? How about that, for not saying much?
It says something about American leadership and people's nervousness that an obscure by-election, American midterms, everyone would pay that much attention to it internationally. Thank you so much. That's it for this week's edition of World Review from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. I want to thank Deb Amos of Princeton and NPR, Philip Stevens of the European University Institute, sorry, got that wrong, Substack and the FT, and Steve Erlanger of the New York Times for what has truly been a great conversation. Eva will be back in 2 weeks. Have a lovely, peaceful Thanksgiving, everyone.
Thank you,
Carla.
Great.
Thanks,
Really
Carla.
Bye. Thanks, Carla.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.